Hi everybody, my name is Johanna. I just want to start with by reiterating a few thank yous. We're all so grateful to the festival for having us. We're also all joined in gratitude really to Sharmila Sen, who's an editor at Harvard University Press, who has really been wonderful to all of us. And I think that I really feel personally very warmly towards both the festival and Sharmila for thinking that the three of us represent classics. Which might not match your mind, that image you have of who is a classicist. I mean, nobody here is wearing a bow tie. So this is, really great and really exciting, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about what we think is going on in classics and maybe what the future of classics is, and to hear from you about what you think about those things here in beautiful Boulder. So I'm going to start by asking Donna and Donnell to say a little bit more about themselves. And I'll start with Donna Zuckerberg, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of a journal that many of you have probably heard about and read called Eidolon. So go ahead, Donna, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Just so you know, we're having a lot of trouble hearing.
Yes, sorry, we'll speak up a little bit. Hello, everyone. As Johanna said, I founded and run an online journal called Eidolon. I've been working for the past 2 years on a book which is due out next year about the reception of ancient Greek and Latin literature mostly, but also history, in the online red pill community, and especially in the alt-right. So that has been a very interesting project as it has developed, and I'll be talking more about that in a moment. I got my PhD from Princeton in 2014.
And I'm Donnell. So I did my undergraduate work at Princeton, and while I was at Princeton, I became interested first in classics, which is where the field I chose to major in, but also in how folks decide which fields of study to pursue and how those decisions map onto social, cultural, and racial structures of power. So after doing my education in classics at Princeton, I got a master's at Oxford and a PhD in classics from Stanford. And I was a postdoc for 2 years at the Columbia Society of Fellows before returning to Princeton in the fall of 2015 now. 2016, I added an extra year to my term, where I am an assistant professor in classics with appointments in the program in Latino Studies, the University Center for Human Values, and the Faculty Fellowship in Service and Civic Engagement. I work primarily on Roman social and religious history, but a big part of my work nowadays has to do with understanding the trajectory of classical reception, especially in American and in Latin American context. And that's been at the forefront of the kinds of things that keep me going and keep me awake at night, especially during these times. So I'll leave it at that.
So one thing that I want to point out is that, being a classicist nowadays, I think that is, the definition of that term is perhaps evolving, and hopefully in some good ways. And so now when people ask, what I do within academia, sometimes I say that, I'm classicist. And one of the things that it really unites Donna, Donnell, and I, and me, is that we've all been writing books that are sort of to more or less of a degree outside of the traditionally defined field of classics. So, Donnell, do you want to say this? Donnell will be talking about his book Undocumented at other sessions here, but do you want maybe to say a word about that and maybe how you kind of see it fitting into your career as a classicist?
Mm-hmm. So earlier I mentioned that as an undergraduate I'd become really interested in...
There's some sort of children's theater program going on.
I just had them turn the microphone off.
Thank you.
Mic time. Oh.
Yeah, mic time would be great. Yeah, close the door, please, and keep it closed. That'd be great.
Mic time. Can you hear me? No. Let's try again. Success. Now I'll try to keep this as close to my mouth as possible. So it just fades in and out. Let's try this one. Take two. No? Okay.
Go back to mic one.
All right. So I will talk a little more loudly and see if we can. Oh, it picked up this time. All right. So earlier I mentioned that as an undergraduate I'd become really interested in why students choose to major in certain fields and not in others. And this had a particular personal resonance for me. I had noticed from my very first classes as an undergraduate that I was the only Afro-Latino male in my Latin and Greek classes. And I began to wonder, well, what shapes this? What drives this? And as part of this, I began to reflect more critically on the status of my own identity, not just as an Afro-Latino male, but as an undocumented immigrant. I'd arrived at Princeton as an undocumented immigrant, I left Princeton as an undocumented immigrant, and eventually I left the United States while still being an undocumented immigrant. So this motivated me to begin plotting a memoir. Initially I was pretty resistant to this idea, but I was sold on the possibility of using the memoir as a means to speak to these broader issues about how folks come to the study of the humanities and how immigrant folk in particular use the humanities as a way of framing and reframing their experiences. So in 2015, the memoir came out entitled Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League. And in the memoir, I attempt to do some interrogation of what my motivations for exploring classics were. The one consequence of the memoir, of the writing of the memoir, of the publication of the memoir, of the reception of the memoir, was that it put me into dialogue with other people who were also thinking about not just questions of access to the field, and we'll certainly be talking about that today, but how even the terms of debate over what counts as access, what counts as diversity, what counts as inclusion, and what counts as contributing to the formulation and promulgation of a classics that is fully inclusive, all mean. And so to that end, I became very interested in the work that Donna was doing at Eidolon. And eventually I was lucky enough to write some stuff for Eidolon, which was all diligently edited by Donna and her team. And so that's how I now find myself thinking about the project of autobiography as a way to open up broader conversations that I think should be having about how differentially situated individuals encounter and navigate fields such as classics.
So, before, I'm going to ask Donna in just a second to hear more about her really interesting forthcoming book. Is this being mailed?
Yeah.
When you look at
Okay, here. But one thing I think that's pretty interesting about what's going on in the field of classics right now is that we're seeing a lot of classicists draw on the skills that they gained throughout their formal training as classicists and apply those skills to different kinds of writing. So I also think of our colleague and friend Helen Morales, who wrote a fabulous book in the Chicago Pilgrimage series about her trip to Dolly World. And it's really fun to read those kinds of books when you know the person as a classicist, because you can see those glimmers of classics peeking through. And so right now I'm wrapping up a profile piece for Eidolon about Daniel Mendelsohn, who also got his PhD in classics. And when I went and interviewed him recently, he said that he had just been in some sort of Twitter back and forth about people who had not liked him reviewing Game of Thrones because they said, you know, what right do you have to do this? You're just a classicist. And he said that his reaction was, it's exactly because I'm a classicist that I know how to review Game of Thrones. So I think that nowadays we're seeing a lot of people use that kind of technical training that people pick up in graduate school, which I think classicists who also have to go through rigorous modern language exams. I mean, it's a shame not to put then knowing how to read French, German, and Italian to use for other things besides classical scholarship. So I think that this is something that we're seeing now quite a bit more, is people taking that kind of training and applying it more broadly. And so with that in mind, I want to ask Donna to tell us a little bit about her forthcoming book.
Does this work? Okay, great. So my book which is currently provisionally titled Not All Dead White Men, had its genesis in an Eidolon article that I was editing about Stoicism and the resurgence of interest in Stoicism.
And that article was titled, "Why is Stoicism Having a Cultural Moment?" And for a while, it was our article with the most traffic. Stoicism actually is having a cultural moment. I hadn't known. So it had this weird traffic spike. You know, as editor, I followed the traffic for all of our articles pretty closely. And it had this weird traffic spike that was coming from Reddit. Does everyone here know what Reddit is? So I traced it back to a Stoicism subreddit, which currently has more than 50,000 subscribers, of people just sharing articles about Stoicism, you know, asking each other questions about Stoicism. But what I noticed was that on this thread where people were discussing the article, there was a discussion about the degree to which the red pill community was responsible for this resurgence of interest in Stoicism. So the red pill community, for anybody here lucky enough not to know, I'm sorry, is a group of mostly men who believe that several liberal ideologies, especially political correctness and feminism, are ruining our country. And they refer to this epiphanic moment where they swallow the red pill, which is a reference to the Matrix, and see our world for what it really is, which is a world that's deeply unfair, mostly to white men. So it's funny until you see the kinds of things these people think.
I just want to say, it's so great to be in a room where everybody's laughing hysterically.
Thank you, yeah. My first thought was that this was very strange, because Stoicism is not something I would associate with these kinds of men. I consider these kinds of men extremely angry, in fact. So part of a major part of the red pill community is the pickup artist community, and there's an offshoot of the pickup artist community, the incel community, the involuntary celibates, which gave rise to Elliot Rodger, the Isla Vista killer. So these are angry people for the most part, and Stoicism is largely about sort of understanding where your emotions come from, and then learning how to, if not master them, then at least understand them and maybe understand their roots so you can move past them. So I looked into this further, and I discovered that the pickup artist community was really interested in Ovid and Ovid's Ars Amatoria, and that was sort of how my book started, with these two instances. I thought that there was a larger thread to be pulled on. But what I discovered, so that was in late 2015. And what I discovered over the course of 2016, as I was reading these websites all the time, it was a really tough time for my mental health, I discovered that they had started as being really very virulently anti-feminist. That was the main ideology in 2015 when I started researching on these sites. And I think that was sort of left over from Gamergate. But then as 2016 went on, I started to see strains of anti-Semitism, and then gradually by the end of 2016, it was outright white supremacy. And that became the really dominant ideological strain on those sites. And the ways in which they were using classics were informed by what the dominant hatred at the time was. So that, I prepared some examples to show. You guys are. So these are from late 2016. These are posters that were put on college campuses around the country right after the election of Donald Trump. They're from a white nationalist group called, I assume it's pronounced Identity Eurova, even in spite of the V. The V is sort of a classics term because it's the U in Latin. And they're using these statues. So on the far left there you have Apollo Belvedere, who that particular statue, which currently is in the Louvre, has a pretty long history of being used by people who want to aestheticize white supremacy and explain why the ideal of beauty. So Winkelmann thought that the Apollo Belvedere was the ideal of beauty. And then in the center there you have, that's Hercules. And then on the far right actually is not an ancient statue, it's a classicizing 17th century sculpture of Julius Caesar from Versailles. And I mean, these slogans are they're pretty anodyne if you look at them. I mean, they don't necessarily say anything extremely white supremacist in themselves, but they are calling to mind a broader ideology, and also the leaders of this group have been implicated in several very violent incidents, especially in Berkeley. Nathan D'Amico, who used to be the head of Identity Robo, was filmed punching an anti-fascist protester. Do either of you want to chime in on this? I could keep talking, but. So that's so the Berkeley event that I just mentioned is on the left there. That you have again far right protesters holding a sign with a helmet. Then I believe they think that the flag says Molon Labe. The flag actually says Molop Lobs, for anybody who reads Greek. Molon Labe is, it's funny if you know Greek. So Molon Labe, so this is, if any of you have seen the 300, that's when the Persians ask the Spartans to hand over their weapons, they say, come and get them. So that's Molon Labe.
I just want to jump in and just say that when this came out, I remember there was the chats, there was quite a lot of speculation about what Labrador retrievers had to do. Come Lab. Who's Molop? I mean, and I actually think there's a very productive conversation to be had about the place of humor in dealing with situations like this, because so the image on the right is from Charlottesville. That's a bunch of marchers holding a shield with the fasces on it. So the Roman symbol of strength through unity, and it doesn't have the axe, so that's sort of an older fascist symbol. But the man in the middle there is the alleged driver of the car that killed protester Heather Heyer. So this is dark and scary stuff to some extent. And the question of how much we should laugh at it is, I think, something that is very open to discussion. But, and also how much is worthwhile. I mean, my tendency would be sort of to mock the Molop Lobs types, and also to ask questions about whether they're really calling upon the Spartans and Thermopylae, or whether they're calling upon Frank Miller's 300, which is sort of an interesting reception question. Is this really reception of ancient Greece, or is this reception of reception? And the kinds of questions that are happening in our discipline right now, so this is Mary Beard. I'm sorry, you can't really see the link there on the bottom. The color didn't come through. But so this is Mary Beard, who is probably the most famous classicist in the world. And she is a columnist for the TLS in her A Don's Life column. And this is her take on how classicists should respond to alt-right misappropriations, or just appropriations. There's another question. What is a misappropriation? What is an appropriation of the classics? And her feeling is that these people make so many mistakes when using the classics. Their understanding of the classics is so shallow that it's sort of not worth it to go beyond pointing out the howlers. But there's, here, hold on. Yep, that's okay, that's my next slide, good. But there's, so that this was from May, I think. Early May, I want to say, or late April, oh, March? Good, perfect, March. This is from September, so very recent. There's some evidence that Mary Beard no longer feels the way she used to, because she has lately taken to really getting into debates with people she always has been getting into debates with people on Twitter, but this was a particularly active dispute, which involved a cartoon from the BBC, depicting Roman Britain and a typical Roman family, which involved some sort of people that appeared to be of African descent, and several alt-right types, especially, so one of the editors of InfoWars, everybody here know what InfoWars is? Yeah, Alex Jones site. One of the editors of InfoWars
published a whole bunch of tweets and videos and articles about how the BBC was blackwashing history, how they were trying to take history away from white people, that that historical accuracy no longer mattered to the BBC as much as political correctness did. And Mary Beer's comment in response was that this actually was historical accuracy, that ancient Rome and Roman Britain had always been ethnically diverse, that there was good evidence for people from all over the Roman Empire, which, as we all know, was quite large, in Roman Britain. And as a result, the amount of abuse and attacks, I believe, of every kind you can imagine came her way. Especially attacks on her credentials, which are excellent by any standard. And this is sort of part and parcel of larger attacks that are happening on anybody in our discipline who tries to present the ancient world as anything other than completely white, which is, problematic for all kinds of reasons, especially because whiteness was not really a concept that existed back then. But, so Danielle and I in particular have recently been subject to some of these fun attacks. So this is somebody who thinks that Danielle is kidnapping people who might be showing a hint of interest in classics. Is that, yeah.
Indoctrinating them.
Yeah. And this is a more recent discussion between Danielle and a former student of his about whether classics should be colorblind or universal, and whether it can be colorblind or universal. So those are some of the slides sort of as food for discussion that I prepared.
So maybe I could take this opportunity, especially with this last slide, because it's frightening, and I think this use of classics, particularly by the alt-right, is something that everybody can kind of easily get behind in terms of being against. But my question, everybody in this room,
Not
would
my
say, I'm
sense.
assuming. No, but and it's a serious point, which is that, but what happens when it's your former student who has a degree in classics? What happens when it's sort of less, it's not someone sort of standing, it's not Moloch Labs in the street with these, kinds of symbols, but that it's something sort of more that's being presented as part of a conversation within the discipline. And so I wanted to ask you both about possible ways you think that classics itself, or people who have more kind of traditional academic authoritative roles in classics, might be a little complicit in what's going on. So I don't know, Danielle.
Yeah, so especially in the context of this exchange, for which I'll provide a little bit of background context, one of the anxieties I have is about, and this gets back to an issue Donna raised, the performance of mastery, I think might be the best way. So, as Donna pointed out when quoting Mary Beard's piece from back in March, there is a feeling, and one I think that some of us, if not many of us in this room, would subscribe to, that in these instances where classics is being hitched to ideological projects that one might find deeply morally objectionable, the responsibility is just to point out mistakes, right? You just point out the howlers, and that'll be the end of that. But there are a couple of issues with this, as far as I'm concerned. The first is that, we live in a post-factual world. I don't know how else to put it. So, in a world where there has been, in an American context, but not only an American context, in which there has been a cloud of epistemic uncertainty hovering over so much of the political discussion, even the academic discussion about classics and its uses. I find that to simply take the position of the teacher, the qualified classicist who knows things and who can point to these mistakes, that this is not sufficient. That this may, in fact, not even sort of rise to the expectations of the occasion, right? So then the question becomes like, what kinds of speech acts, what forms of rhetorical intervention are available to you in situations like this. And so this gets me now to this exchange I had. So earlier this summer, Solveig Lucia Gold, who graduated from Princeton this spring and who graduated with several of the university's top prizes, including the top undergraduate award, the Moses Pine Prize, and who had majored in classics at Princeton, wrote a piece for the New Criterion entitled The Colorblind Bard. And her piece argued that the classics should be universal, and that the classics is, if sort of done correctly, colorblind. Now, as part of this piece, she acknowledges in passing that there are many terrible things that have been done in the service of classics, but this is put off to the side. This is assumed to be some kind of misfire of classics, and not as sort of deeply wired or as foundational to the constitution of classics as a field, to classics as a canon of values, so on and so forth. And so after reading the piece, and after noticing that Solveig had cited the presence of several people of color in the classics department at Princeton as proof that classics was colorblind, and the two examples she cited were yours truly and a Korean American student in the department who was an undergrad major at the time, and along with referring to other folks of color in the department. I decided that I should write a response. I did not do this without some hesitation. As several people pointed out to me, there was a sort of power asymmetry in the fact that a professor was suddenly deciding to sort of write at this undergrad, this newly minted undergrad, alumna of the university. But after weighing it, I decided, you know what, I should do this, and so I wrote a response. And my response was, didn't really try to mince words, because I don't believe in the value of subtlety in addressing situations like this. So I wanted to be very sort of straightforward and uncompromising in presenting my own position on these issues, which to boil down what one reader of this piece referred to as jargony gobbledygook comes down to this. It's not enough, as I see it, to say that classics is being appropriated or misappropriated by the alt-right. I mean, I think this is very real and very pernicious, and I think we need to be very accountable to ourselves and to our communities in laying out reasons for how this is a problem and what we can do to respond to it. I think it's important, as part of that diagnosis of the problem, to take into consideration how the long history of classics is implicated in projects of domination and power, and how classics has been repeatedly hitched to forms of racialized violence across space and time in medieval, early modern contexts. And how, in fact, the very configuration of the classical as a system of values is tied up with the depreciation of other modes of education and learning. And this is, in fact, something I had drawn attention to briefly in my memoir by pointing out that my initial exposure to classics, which came when I was living in a New York City shelter, came right at around the same time that I noticed that there were no books on Dominican history anywhere. There was this book on Greek and on ancient Greece and Rome that I found in the shelter and that opened many doors to me. But that recovery and that encounter of this tradition involved a silencing and effacing of a different kind of tradition. And this in turn is implicated in the broader power dynamics of classics. So I had laid out these points in this response to Solveig. And well, I will leave it to you to read her full response to my response. But one point that was raised by a good friend of mine on Facebook, and one that I've since been reflecting on, is how to model these kinds of interactions as a space for pedagogical conversation, right? Because what my friend pointed out, I think very justifiably, is that whether you're sort of trained professionally in classics, whether you're trained in other fields of the humanities, or even if you have simply sort of gone through the process of writing expository essays in undergraduate and graduate context period, we receive some inculcation in the arts of the withering critique or the acerbic riposte, right? But what we do not receive nearly as much training in is in the art of empathetic dialogue with other interlocutors. Now, sometimes I don't want to have empathetic dialogue with other interlocutors because I think that they are wrong, and I think that they are deeply wrong in ways that I find ethically objectionable, right? But there is an ethical call here, and I confess to not really knowing the best ways of addressing this within my own writing, within my own pedagogy. I have adopted this sort of like stance of radical or seemingly radical open-endedness in some of the classes that I teach, in which I sort of withhold from my students everything that I might think of on a topic. But like, I mean, I'm easily Googled. Like, it doesn't take that long to figure out what I'm likely to be thinking about things, you know,
Same.
or what my stance is. So, I mean, there's like a sort of upper bound on this. It's like an exercise in plausibility, right? So, these are just some of the questions that have been playing in the back of my mind in the aftermath of this exchange.
I just wanted to provide a little more context on this as well. So Solveig's original Colorblind Bard piece was in response to the conversations that arose after President Trump's speech in Warsaw in, I think it was June or July, where he spoke about the values of Western civilization. And this is a discourse that classics as a field has long been implicated in because it benefits directly from the valorization of Western civilization as sort of the height of culture. And that's one of the things that brings students to our classrooms is the value of Western civilization. So that's a discourse that many in our field feel an ethical responsibility to try to tear down in a lot of ways. And to talk about how the concept of Western civilization has been mobilized in often extremely pernicious ways. The Nazis are an obvious example that comes to mind. So sorry, that was just a little bit more, I think, understanding where her piece was coming from, why she was trying to argue that actually Western civilization is for everyone, which is what Donnell was responding to.
Yeah, so this, I think, is part of a bigger conversation that's really taking place across the discipline of classics right now, and which has really been facilitated quite a lot by having Eidolon as a platform now available, is how can we maybe rethink and rewrite a lot of the rhetoric that you still find on websites for things like the Junior Classical League that talk about how people should study classics because Western civilization has an enormous debt, which is a very interesting word for me, an enormous debt to Greece and Rome. So how can that the sort of reasons for studying classics perhaps be reframed in a way that doesn't necessarily rely on, or doesn't at all rely on the primacy of something that we call Western civilization. So I guess maybe with that question in mind, I would ask both Donnell and Donna to tell us a little bit about why studying classics is still worth it, perhaps.
But I mean, you should talk about debts and
Yeah,
indebtedness. I mean, we have to give you a platform for this. You need to jump in and tell us about.
You didn't even really introduce yourself.
I know. You think you're going to avoid this, but you're not.
Well, so I wrote a book that came out in May called The Classical Debt, Greek Antiquity in an Era of Austerity. The title went through a lot of revisions, so it's hard for me to remember now. But the book basically examines this notion, the historical development of a notion that Western civilization owes some sort of debt to ancient Greece as weighed against very real monetary debt in Greece. So it begins with classical Athens and looks at how the classical Athenians constructed a rhetoric around the rest of Greece owing them something for the putative Athenian role in defeating the Persian invasions of mainland Greece, and then kind of jumps ahead to the formation of the modern nation state of Greece, which really was born amid bankruptcy, essentially. A lot of loans were needed for the effort for the War of Independence, which began in 1821. And those were very bad loans from the start. Very small percentages of the loans actually went towards financing that effort. A lot of it went right back into interest payments to Britain, to France, right, to the creditors, if that sounds familiar. That was the point of the book. So, and it traces that then up to today, where constantly in the media, I think, this notion of some sort of abstract debt to ancient Greece is put up against Greece's very real
an ongoing economic and humanitarian crisis. So that was the way, I guess, in which that book also sort of is kind of classics adjacent, in that it follows a thread through a lot of modern Greece and some other places and times too. Having said that, Donnell and Donna are not getting out of answering the question that I posed, which is, so if the classics has this history, right, and if these aren't the only texts, right, which we know well, the only texts we're studying, we're reading, we're teaching, why study and read and teach them today?
Sure. I mean, the reason I was hoping you talk about that a little bit is because I think this rhetoric of value is very germane to the conversation. So I get, when Twitter trolls come for me, which happens on a near daily basis, my expertise gets called into question quite a bit. And this often happens along sort of gendered and racialized lines as well. But the other sort of line of attack that I get pretty often is about value, that I don't really love the classics, that I actually hate the classics, and that I'm looking to destroy them, possibly because I'm trying to get payback for the destruction of the temple. But people say this to me all the time. But that I'm trying to diminish the value, the cultural capital of the classics by taking this critical stance toward them. And it's absurd to say that anybody who has spent, there's no reason to study classics for a decade unless you enjoy studying it. I don't feel like I should even need to, I don't respond to those people. But I think that question of value is a very important one, and one that we need to come up with a better answer for. Like, what is the value of classics and of ancient Greece and ancient Rome if it's not the foundation of Western civilization? What? So what? So I don't have an answer, and that's why I create an online journal to provide a platform for a lot of people to provide their answers. I have some answers, but.
I don't have a set answer either. I have been thinking though about a point that was raised the other week by a former teacher of mine and former Princeton colleague who's now at Oxford, Constanze Butenke. She gave this paper at a conference I was attending on what she charmingly described as the emotions in a minor key. And what she wanted to do with this paper was to explore how we might begin to fashion a humanistic discourse about why it is that we do what we do. That's not premised on, say, the feeling of intense devotion and love for your subject, but that is premised on lukewarm feeling. Curiosity that does not rise to the level of like a sort of 100% high octane excitement all the time, right? And so her motivation in pursuing this project was partly to set up a corrective of sorts to the many sort of disciplinary and extra-disciplinary practices, or any social practices that condition us into thinking that, well, if you're pursuing something like the classics, or you're pursuing something in the humanities, it really must be because you love it. You love it at all costs. You're prepared to surrender yourself, body and soul, to this. And so she wanted to sort of probe the possibilities of imagining a different kind of affective ecology, let's call it, in which people could begin to reckon with the fact that, well, their encounters with the classical and with the humanities are quite frequently associated with things like tedium, boredom, exhaustion, again, the sort of like not quite boiling point curiosity, all these feelings that normally don't get as much play. But this has been lingering in mind ever since, because when I think about what the classics has come to mean for me, I have made a point of writing in sort of many settings, beginning with your standard sort of undergraduate applications or your postgraduate applications, that the classics was exhilarating and it was invigorating, and it provided me this canvas against which I could begin sort of imagining a new conception of myself, all of this stuff, right, that I now look back on and sort of cringe with shame at having written. But even so, as I go back and sort of second guess some of the things I've written, trying to explain the appeal of the classics to me, I try to reflect on those moments where I did feel, intoxicated by the classics. And those moments of intoxication have tended to come at times when I felt that I was engaging in dialogues that crisscrossed many different communities in time and space. So, one of the points that I've raised in conversations with my students, and something for which I owe a great deal to mobilize the language of debt again, to work in perception, is the idea of classics as being, endlessly intermediated, right? So when I am reaching back to, the Romans, I'm of course not reaching to them directly. There are many interlocutor communities that stand between me and the Romans. The Romans themselves were not some sort of unified, discrete thing. They consisted of many communities too, spread out across space and time. And so in the project of attempting to recover for myself and attempting to recover in scholarship, these critical junctures in the history that I study, I find myself having a conversation with many, many different communities in space and time. And I like this. I think this is really cool. And so that's the value of the classical on one level. But on another level, the reason I continue to be drawn to the study of the classics, and the reason why I think it is valuable-ish, is because it gives me a site of contestation. And that site of contestation is intimately bound up with the questions that Donna and Johanna have put on the table about, well, why is it that we value something that has been so implicated in projects of domination, in this Western civilizational discourse that has systemically disenfranchised people who are not deemed part of Western civilization? And so my take on the classics now is that the classics exist to be tested. It exists to be tested by many different communities in the contemporary present to whom access to the classics has historically been denied. And if the classics survives this test, that's great. And if classics were to die, well, maybe it rises phoenix-like from the ashes, or maybe it disappears and is replaced by something else. Donna was in attendance for this talk I gave at Stanford that was inspired partly by Spivak's Death of a Discipline. And I had sort of mused aloud at this talk about whether, whether classics should die as a field, whether they should just sort of go up in smoke. And it's at various points in this talk I sort of cheekily said, oh, I'd be cool with that. Like if it goes up in smoke, like that's fine. But the whole idea of thinking about the end of the discipline is to force oneself to think about why one values the discipline in the first place. So this project too of envisioning how the classics might come to an end is, as I see it, a catalyst for reevaluating our priorities. If we feel that classics has to be kept alive somehow, or if it has to be reanimated, if we think that it's dying or moribund or whatever, then we have to ask ourselves, well, why are we committing to this? And what form of classics is it that we are trying to sort of keep alive in this 21st century moment?
And one of the things that Mary Beard says in her Confronting the Classics book is that classics has always been in a state of decline, at least since the Renaissance. At least since the Renaissance, and I would even argue further back, sort of to like the Library of Alexandria. You have people looking back at a time when the literature was richer, arguably, of course, but that was sort of the rhetoric, and that the discipline, or that how not just the discipline, how the whole world the energy and the edginess that happens when people interact with the classics, that it comes in part from this frisson of worrying that classics is about to die. So that actually is, that fear is something that has always been something that's extremely productive for our field.
So we wanted to leave some time for questions. So does anybody have any? And maybe if you could say your name, and I don't know if we could get the mics back, but maybe if you could just project, but please go ahead.
My name is Susan Josephs, and I dropped onto this campus in 1962 from New York City, where I've gone to an all-girls high school. And one of the differences between 62 and when my own children went to college is that I was allowed to play, and I could take anything I wanted to take in school. I didn't have to do it for a career. And that's changed now because of the cost of school. I dropped into a class offered by Hazel Barnes, and I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And had Hazel been teaching basket weaving, I would have majored in basket weaving, but I majored in Greek and Latin instead because Hazel was here. She's revered, if anybody hasn't heard of her, as probably the greatest professor that has ever taught here by anybody who ever took a class with her. So I think one of the differences is that the idea of the classics is maybe more dead than it used to be because people can't just take a course in classics for the heck of it to see what it's all about. But the question I have is, have you considered, and I can't call him what you call him, I call him pussy grabber, have you considered that the rise of pussy grabber happened because of the Atlantic's recent article, which is called How the American Mind How America Lost Its Mind, about this whole notion of truthiness now being more prominent than truth?
Do you want me to? I can take a stab at this. I think that the rise of pussy grabber is overdetermined, and so I hesitate to sort of pin it down on any sort of one development in, say, political discourse or intellectual discourse. I do think that pussy grabber has capitalized on many trends that have now sort of resurfaced, but that had already been diagnosed by people like Richard Hofstadter, for example. Anti-intellectualism in American public life was, written by Hofstadter at a time when, well, maybe there was a more sort of generally accepted standard of what might be considered to be truth and what might have sort of epistemic salience, right? So all of that out of the way, I did want to touch on something that you'd raised by way of introducing yourself and your exposure to Greek and Latin, which is there has been a real, to the extent that one can make these kinds of generalizations, and I am uneasy about it, there's been a loss in the opportunity to cultivate college education as a ludic enterprise, as a place where people can play. And that is to a large degree dictated by things like the staggering rise in college tuition, the saddling of undergraduates and postgraduates with massive debt burdens. We get back to debt again. The accelerant incentives to pick fields that will promise a return on investment, things like that. But I also feel that it's hard to sort of pinpoint one or two developments on the educational landscape when, in a sense, these processes are so holistic. They encompass so many different domains of American life that it's hard for me sometimes to sort of carve them up. And I mean, we're not even thinking about, possibly we should be thinking about the dialogue between the rise of pussy grabber and its recursive effects on the educational landscape in the US, and sort of broader international trends that have also contributed to what Pankaj Mishra and others have termed the age of anger, right? And so there too is, I think, an invitation for us to consider how our educational project can speak not only to what's happening in the contemporary US, but also what's happening in other parts of the world. And this is, once again, an opportunity to sort of test the classics, as it were. If we are so keen to insist on the value of classics, then how does that value enter into conversation with this age of anger that Pankaj Mishra and others have pointed to? And what does the classics do besides, say, provide a space for play? Play is important, right? And so maybe we might want to say that the kinds of play that are facilitated by exposure to Greek and Latin texts are, well, now we get into the exceptionalist language, are distinctive, are special. This is where we now have to begin to refine what it is that makes the species of play cultivated under the classics umbrella so worth holding on to. And to that I don't have a clear answer.
Oh, thank you. So I just had a couple of questions. First, I thought I'd make a little bit of a statement about how do you argue with the, kind of alt-right folks who are using classics and kind of like questioning experts, expertise and stuff like that. In my opinion, there's a certain, I think everybody can sort of set ground rules for themselves on or parameters for themselves on how they're going to speak with people, argue with people, and debate with people. There's a certain point in time where you have to realize that you're not arguing with somebody who's being reasonable, and physically or otherwise, you probably just need to shut them down. And so I think we're probably at the point with a lot of the alt-right folks where it's less a question of how do we continue their arguments and let ourselves be psychologically damaged, and how do we just shut these people down? And so I think that's just one of the things. The other thing is, when it comes to why, how have classics been appropriated by these people, like the Nazis and, and folks like Wagner that have kind of with neoclassicism led to that sort of racial ideology and stuff like that. And I think it comes to a lot what you said, Donna, that this was like in the aftermath of a lot of the Gamergate stuff and everything, and a lot of it comes down to threatened masculinity. And I really feel like, there's less of an intellectual valuation of Greek and Roman culture and more of a visceral evaluation of this stuff as an ideal that's set up, for masculinity. This kind of like, every male body is, made out of marble muscles and everything like that, and that's enough for people. And and if you can build yourself up on that sort of emotional platform, you can sort of give any argument you make enough oomph to make yourself sound like an expert and really to kind of browbeat people who might have more reasonable arguments into a corner. So I mean, it's just a thought that I have. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that.
It's hard because on the one hand I don't think there's anything really to be gained from discussion with these people. You cannot convince them. In part because of a pickup artist principle called frame control, which essentially amounts to, letting somebody change your mind is weakness. So, but on the other hand, but if I were to engage with them, I don't really necessarily think that I'd be engaging with them for the purpose of attempting to change their minds, which I consider an impossible task. I would be engaging with them for the purpose of some kind of performance for my audience, whoever that happens to be. And in fact, I think that when they troll me, I'm also really not their intended audience. It sounds very personal, their attacks, but I don't really think they care about me. I think that they are performing for each other. It's some kind of, massive homosocial bonding experience of let's mock these silly SJW, lefty academics. So that sort of enters a separate field of questions for what would it mean to respond to trolls as a performance for people who are more sympathetic to you. But we can leave that aside for the moment. What I want to do as a scholar is respond to all the, every body is made of white marble muscles. Because I think that's actually that's an excellent way of characterizing their classics. To respond to it by saying, well, actually, not all marble was white. The marble statues were painted. If you want to talk about somebody like Aristotle, then there's all kinds of. You could talk about the economics of creating a philosophical school, and obviously not every body is made of white marble muscles. But so again, if I made those arguments, I wouldn't be making them for these people who would then just accuse me of blackwashing history.
in the back, and then.
Thank you for mentioning Hazel Barnes. I was a colleague of hers, and she was a mentor of mine, and we taught for many years a humanities course. And so I want to broaden this definition of classics. I am a pseudo-classicist. I taught the Odyssey, the Iliad, Greek plays, all in translation. I know a little bit of Latin. I know no Greek. And my basic question is the value of teaching the classics in the humanities context outside of majoring in classics in the traditional department. And I'll just make one comment. It's kind of self-aggrandizing, so I apologize. But one of the treasured notes that I received, slipped under my door in my office, was in about 1980. I had taught and been teaching this humanities course, which started with the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the note was from a Vietnam veteran. And he had come back from Vietnam and taken this humanities course. And he said that reading the Iliad and the Odyssey gave him some framework and context for him to re-enter into life with his experience in Vietnam. And I just thought that was wonderful. So I celebrate the humanities in a little broader sense, knowing my limitations.
And there are a lot of really wonderful programs that use sort of the cultural weight of ancient texts, but in translation, toward that sort of end. So the Warrior Scholar Project, for instance, takes people who went sort of from high school into the army and are now trying to go to and are now kind of starting college as a way to, so they would be entering college without or far removed from some of the core competencies that a lot of entering freshmen have, right? They haven't written a paper in many years, for example. So the Warrior Scholar Project, it's sort of they call it an academic boot camp. They read a lot of these texts and they write essays about it, and it leads to, the statistics show that they then perform much better. And also, Danielle can speak to this more than I can, but there are an increasing number of courses of classics professors who teach text and translation in prison settings. So, absolutely, I don't think any of us are trying to deny the lasting value, the word that keeps coming up here, of classical literature to mean something to people. We're just sort of trying to quantify it or explain it or understand how it's being mobilized. And especially the issue of sort of freshman sequences in Western civilization. That's a big, difficult question right now. If anybody here has heard about what's happening at Reed College, where they have an active protest happening in their freshman humanities sequence of people who feel that the introductory humanities sequence is sort of perpetuating white supremacy. So.
I think that one part did you have a question?
Mine might be quick, I think. I was just curious about, which particular narratives in the classics are people finding more relevant to their lives right now with everything from the political situation going on to just their everyday lives? Like which particular narratives in which texts?
So I'll single out just one. There are quite a few that have attained visibility recently, but migration and narratives of migration in classical texts. So there have been several classicists recently working on projects that have sought to bring out for broader audiences how Greek and Roman texts speak to issues of migration and mobility. I'm thinking, just to give one example, of Alessandro Barchiesi, who has been in consultation with an Italian TV program that has relied on the Aeneid to reimagine what contemporary migration, especially migration across the Mediterranean taking place right now, can and should receive in the way of reassessment and reevaluation through the prism of classical text, right? We can turn to texts on the Greek side too. I mean, there have been adaptations of Aeschylus' Suppliants, for example, that have tried to underline much the same point. And so that's one strand. The Odyssey plays a role in this strand too. Another one, and this, Donna alluded to this in her response to the previous question, has to do with carcerality and the degrees to which Greek and Roman texts can speak to issues of confinement and immobility. And so here, the Odyssey is actually quite good because the Odyssey managed to cover both issues of sort of intensified mobility and issues of complete immobility. And so these strands in classics, I think, can be productively put in dialogue with broader pedagogical and curricular innovations that have served to address students and address teachers who, out of their subject positions, can reflect critically with the aid of these texts on these contemporary issues.
I think that, I'm sorry, yeah, I know. I think that's time, well, I know it's time. Well, thank you so much for coming to this. We, I think, hope to convince you that, I mean, I don't know if I would say it's a good time to be a classicist, but it's definitely an interesting one. So thank you all for coming, and thanks for Donna.